everybody, and thanks for joining our weekly podcast. I'm Robin Lewis, founder and CEO of the Robin Report, which, by the way, is, we believe, much more than a daily report. It really is a knowledge platform. We connect the dots strategically. We point out major issues in the industry, how major retailers and brands are reacting to them. And it's all about, what's happening, why is it important, and how is it going to affect the business of the companies we're writing about and talking about. Anyway, so we're a platform, and from which we communicate thought leadership on various strategic topics through the daily reports, but also these podcasts. And we have webinars and hopefully in the future live events. So along with our chief strategist, Shelley Kohan, also, by the way, a professor at FIT and Syracuse University, we welcome you to our conversation on the topic of why unions and why a potential resurgence of them. So Shelley, I thought I'd lead off with a very brief context, which I think will provide a guideline for our discussion. The first recorded union, by the way, in the United States was in 1794 in Philadelphia, a shoemakers union.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, make a lot of shoes down there. Anyway, but the real growth in unions, as you know, began in the late 1800s, early 19th century. Around the industrial revolution, there was the AFL-CIO, Teamsters Union, United Auto Workers, which is a big one,
yeah,
and others. And simply the reason for unions along at that time, and Shelley, this will be an important part of our discussion. The reason they were created was to help the workers with work-related difficulties, such as low pay, unsafe or unsanitary working conditions, long hours, and other situations, which of course all seemed like a great idea, particularly during that time when the country was really ramping up from the Industrial Revolution. But on the flip side, workers often had problems with their bosses as a result of their membership in the unions. And so during the 1977 to the 1997 period, there was a big decline in labor unions' share of workers. The share in unions fell from 25% to 14%.
Wow.
1997. I mean, that's like, 44% decline. In manufacturing, as you can imagine and know, the fall was even greater. And that was down from 38% to 18%. Major reasons, probably obviously increased competition, especially international. And this was a big time in textile apparel and a whole slew of consumer goods who outsourced their manufacturing to the Far East and other countries. Also, a decline in pro-union attitudes during that period. And finally, there was a mounting pushback by management across all industries, and for some very good reasons, because actually some of the unions became so strong that they were abusive. I mean, one anecdotal thing was that, the auto workers union out in Detroit, if consumer demand slowed for, let's say, Ford, the Ford brand, and they would slow down production, but the unions had negotiated a deal with their workers that they would pay them for a minimum number of hours per week. So for a long time, on and off, some of these workers who just hang out in a, you know, in an area where they sit down, have coffee, read the newspaper and so forth. So in effect, the unions were, Ford Motor Company was paying workers not to work. Anyway, so there are a lot of other stories like that. Anyway, Shelley, there seems to be a resurgence of unionization in a number of industries. And broadly, we could, cite some general reasons. One being workers not wanting to go back to the same jobs where they were when, of course, the pandemic really kind of forced them out of work or made it risky for them. Or workers just wanting to land a better job since there is so much demand from a much smaller pool of unemployed workers, who, by the way, may be still spending the money the government gave them during the pandemic, which, as you know, was enormous fire hosing money out there to consumers and also to companies as well. And then, there are those companies like Amazon where their distribution center employees, led by one guy, to form a union to negotiate better wages and working conditions has really become kind of a big deal. And of course, you got Starbucks out there and its unionization attempts, and its CEO, Howard Schultz, actually was publicly quoted ripping apart the very concept of unions. Anyway, we'll come back a little later to those stories and others. But first, Shelley, can you kind of give us an update on this potential resurgence and what industries and why it's happening? Have you got some numbers on all of that?
Sure. And Robin, while there's some examples like Amazon and Starbucks and some others, and it would make it seem like there's a resurgence of unions or union representation, it's actually down in 2021 compared to prior years. So when we look at 2020, 10.8% of all workers were in unions compared to in 2021, which was 10.3. So the same rate pre-pandemic. So in 2019, it was 10.3, it went up to 10.8, now it's back down to 10.3. As a comparison, in 1983, that's really the first year that the Bureau of Labor Statistics began showing comparable data. The union rate was at 20.1%.
Yeah.
So union workers are less than half today than they were in 1983. But I also think it's important to kind of separate the public and private sectors. So you and I, we're really talking about the private sector business, retail, wholesale trade, the public sector, including local government like firefighters, police, teachers. They have a much higher union rate, which sits right around 34%.
Wow. Yeah.
The private sectors only sits around, 6% or 6.1%. So 20 years ago, the public sector was 37, it's now 34, so it's decreased a little bit. And the private sector's 6.2% in 2019, with the highest union representation in utilities, motion pictures, and transportation and warehousing.
Got it, Shelley. And the distinction between private and public unions is important. I mean, teachers, policemen, firefighters, and other public entities are necessary local and national services, right? For all of the United States, and not driven by profitable growth such as private companies. So for private company XYZ, for example, continually raising profits and lowering costs is, kind of baked in the cake as to what they do. So if management is, suppressing wages or cutting costs in other ways that negatively affect the workers, then forming or being a member of a union gives the workers some relative strength to push back and gain higher wages, or other benefits. Public unions are not as conflicted between leaders and workers because protecting and serving the citizenry is really the objective of both. So, but anyway, let's drill down a bit. Tell us about the the retail trades kind of, specifically.
Sure. I mean, there's several industries that kind of represent what we would call our industry, retail, wholesale, trade. And these are numbers that are workers that are represented by unions. One could be represented by a union, but not actually be in the union. So I chose to select workers represented by unions. So wholesale trade in 2000 was 6%. Now it's at 4.5%. The retail trade was at 6.6% back in 2000. Now it's 5%. Transportation and warehousing was at 27%. Now it's down to 18%. And food services and drinking places was at 1.9%. And now it's at 1.6%. But keep in mind that as workers are asking for more benefits, higher wages, when they vote for unionization, like, for example, the workers did in the Amazon warehouse or the REI store, and at I think there's 25 Starbucks stores, we actually aren't going to see those contracts come to fruition until at least a year or two from now. So once a vote's ratified for workers, and workers say they do want to be represented by a union, the real work actually begins, so to speak. So the contract has to be negotiated back and forth between the union and the employer. And as you mentioned, unions will negotiate wage, benefits, and conditions of work. But this has to be done by every class of worker. So if Amazon has an abundance of classifications, which they do, of workers, the union has to negotiate every single class of workers. So it typically takes a normal union contract anywhere from 18 months to 2 years.
Wow.
So here's what we do know. This is the most interesting fact, I think. During the first 6 months of 2022, union representation petitions filed at the National Labor Relations Board has increased 57%.
Oh boy, there you go. Okay.
Yeah, so these are petitions filed, and the time period that we looked at was October 21 through March of 2022 compared to last year. 57%.
Amazing.
So according to the National Labor Relations Board, you file a petition. It's filed by employees, unions, or employers. And then the field office of the NLRB has to then determine if employees want to be represented by a union. Then they investigate the petitions. And if it's meritorious, then it conducts an election to allow employees to decide whether or not they actually want to be represented by a union.
Yeah, so there's a whole process here that takes a long time. So,
right.
So Shelley, yeah. And I understand the NLRB is running out of money. I assume maybe it's because of the surge you just mentioned.
They can't keep up.
Yeah, right. So the general counsel of the NLRB, Jennifer Abruzzo, said in its April report that while our dedicated board agents continue to process petitions and conduct elections and investigate and prosecute statutory violations and obtain remedies for victims of unfair labor practices, the National Labor Relations Board needs a significant increase of funds to obviously fully effectuate the mission of the agency. But Shelley, if it is because of the 57% increase in petitions in the first 6 months of 2022, doesn't that indicate the beginning of a resurgence in unions, and why now?
Yes, Robin. Yes, it does. That's exactly what I think is happening. More and more employees are becoming interested in unions. There was a Gallup poll of Americans, and it polled Americans' approval of unions. So that establishes the percent of Americans who view labor unions favorably. And this rate has gone up from 48% in 2009 to 68% in 2021.
There you go. Okay.
So the last time this many Americans viewed unions positively was 1965.
Wow.
Union membership rate in the United States was near an all-time high then as well. So workers are really turning to unions to have more of a voice on wages, benefits, conditions of work.
Yep.
The other interesting part is that there's this higher educated worker in lower paying jobs. So you have college educated workers who feel compelled to stand up, and they feel responsible to take action to support those who cannot fairly represent themselves. So my son is a Gen Z, and he made a speech in front of 100 people. This was back in 7th grade. He wrote this speech himself. And one major point of his speech, which he, like I said, he wrote it himself, he wanted to help others by speaking up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. This was really important to him. Now, mind you, he was in middle school, and get this, Robin, he is a motivational hype dancer. I'll explain that later.
Yeah.
But he's very comfortable, standing up and speaking in front of other people. But these younger generations, these Gen Z and Alphas, they really want to help others stand up for themselves.
Shelley, the example of your son and his confidence and desire to help, those who are challenged, it really kind of confirms something I've been theorizing, that the millennials and Gen Zs, let's face it, they inherited a messy world. And now only they can save it. Well, your son and many others I have come to know, it really confirms my hope that they can do it. But that's a whole nother story. So, but your point on well-educated workers helping those who are more challenged, I read in the New York Times article that one of the Amazon organizers had a PhD in public policy. It blew my mind.
Wow.
Anyway, and she helped to translate union organizing text messages to Arabic and French.
Wow.
I can't believe it.
Well, the organizer in the REI store in Manhattan was a college grad also. So the support of labor unions among college graduates specifically increased 55% in the late 90s to 70% in the last few years. This also according to the Gallup data, and was mentioned in that same New York Times article.
Yeah. So Shelley, here's another indication that we may be on the edge of a resurgence. And I really do believe this kind of altruistic mission of young, well-educated people, I really do believe in it.
Yeah, I do too. Here's something interesting I also found in the data when I was looking at it. Most industries, and I looked through all the different industries, they had an increase in union representation in 2008 and 2009. So this was following the 2007, as you remember, Robin, housing prices went up, homeowners couldn't sell their house, afford payments, led to the Great Recession, global financial crisis, and economic downturn. So as we continue to hear not only analysts, but CEOs talking about the possibility of a recession on its way in the US market, it'll be interesting to see if union representation picks up. It makes sense workers feel more squeezed with wages and are looking for probably more stable work.
Yeah. The Great Recession, as we call it now, had an impact on the number of college grads getting jobs in the workforce.
Right.
College educated workers, a tight labor market, and a possible recession all really may give rise to more union activity in the private sector, of course, especially in service and warehouse jobs where workers may feel totally underappreciated or unsafe, really.
Yeah, and the pandemic has certainly impacted how workers feel they should be treated, and there is a growing concern over workplace safety and employees' own well-being.
Shelley, I believe it will only grow more so, especially if we enter a recession. I do believe, though, recession aside, I believe a new normal type of union, nothing like the way it used to be. I believe this new normal type union will be architected, by college graduates and people like your son who will be creating a whole new normal world with aspirational unions, or I don't know, maybe Pollyanna? Not me. Any other comments, Shelley, to close?
Well, the only thing I would say is at the end of the day, in the words of my great friend and colleague, Bert Kamen, who we actually had on our podcast, Mr. Smalls is now Mr. Big. He's resurrecting unions. Simply said, my friend Kamen said, happy workers don't unionize. So you said it in your opener, low wages, lack of promotions, benefits that don't demonstrate a commitment to workers, unsafe conditions. All of these things are certainly going to incite more union activity.
Yep.
So
and by the way, Shelley, Mr. Smalls, for those who don't remember, was the Amazon employee who started the whole union thing over there. And that's what he said, Mr. Smalls is now Mr. Big. Anyway.
Yeah, for our listeners, you can find more of our podcasts on Apple, Spotify, Buzzsprout, and therobinreport.com. Look for us on YouTube where we broadcast our podcast as well. And please follow us on social media, link in with us, and follow us on Twitter for the latest thoughts about the industry.
And I want to thank everybody once again so much for being with us today. As I mention every week, if any of you have some topics that you would like Shelley and I to cover, just send me an email at robin@therobinreport.com. And thanks once again.